Good morning for everyone. My idea in this keynote is to present some basis of the human rights to water and sanitation, firstly. I will also introduce the mandate. What is this special rapporteur, how it fits into the mechanism of the Human Rights Council, and what are the main activities of what we call the special procedures of the Human Rights Council. This is a way to discuss with you different ways to address the human rights to water and sanitation through particularly the thematic reports that I submit to the Council. Then I will talk a little bit about the current picture in the world using some monitoring data from the SDGs and to show to you some concerns related to the human rights to water and sanitation, particularly inequalities in the access to water and sanitation in several parts of the world. So my challenge is to do that in 1 hour or a little bit less, but let's see. Yeah, firstly, very quickly, the legal foundation of the human rights to water and sanitation. Yes, in the contemporary time, we can identify in the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights the basis, the initial basis for all the economic, social, and cultural rights, in which the rights to water and sanitation usually are included. And we can identify in the Article 25(1) the reference to the standard of living. All people have the right to have a minimal standard of living, which includes housing and some other rights, but obviously there is no reference to water at that time. Then in 1966, actually, it entered in power in 76. We had the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that defined and give interpretation of this Article 25 and other articles on the Declaration that relates to economic, social, and cultural rights. But again, there's no mention to water here. Then in following years, there were some conventions that started to mention the right to water, the Convention on the Rights to the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we start to identify some references to the right to water, not the right to sanitation, but basically the right to water. And then in 2002, we had a very key document, the General Comment 15. Yesterday, I learned that we have someone here in the room that had an active role on this, on drafting this General Comment, our colleague Malcolm. And this was a very key document because it gave an interpretation of the right to water. At this moment, again, only water, not sanitation, but it's a very complete and very comprehensive document with several definitions related to what's the meaning of the right to water, what are the obligations of states, etc. And then finally, in 2010, the General Assembly adopted a resolution recognizing explicitly the right to water and the right to sanitation. Now, sanitation was included as part of the right to water. In the same year, the Human Rights Council adopted another resolution with similar meaning. Then we had subsequent resolutions since 2010. In general, 1 year in the General Assembly, the other year in the Human Rights Council on the same issue, but giving interpretation of different aspects of those rights. One important thing that happened in these further resolutions was the resolution of the General Assembly of 2015 that recognized that the right to water and the right to sanitation are distinct rights. So this is the reason that now my mandate is called the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights. We are using the plural to signaling that we have two distinct rights, although we should consider that those rights are integrated. That they are at the same time distinct, but we need to address them in an integrated way. So this, in very general terms, these are the basis and the legal foundations, the main legal covenants and instruments that we use to give interpretation of different aspects of the human rights to water and sanitation. Very, very quickly, the human right to water includes different contents, and basically the right to water ensures everyone without discrimination to have water with these features: water available, physically accessible, affordable, safe, that means with a quality that ensures the protection of health of the users, and culturally acceptable. And water for personal and domestic use. This is an interesting discussion. Maybe in the roundtable we can go deeper on that. What about water for food? What about water for subsistence agriculture? What about water for other uses that are very, very key for the life of people, for instance, that live in rural areas? So this is something that I would say is still a little bit open, and it can be a matter for more development. This is another important aspect. We are not talking only about water at the household level, but also water in other spheres of life that requires safe water, like schools, hospitals, workplaces, etc., public spaces. These are some definitions of each of these elements of the normative content. I will not go in details on that. I will just highlight that, for instance, affordability is a very important element. Affordability is something very linked to human rights, and my perception is that affordability is not exactly in the culture of the water providers. They usually think on economic sustainability and not on the needs of the poorest part of the population. And into this element of affordability, one important definition is that disconnection due to the inability to pay can be considered a violation of the human rights, because people is not allowed to access the services because the incapacity to pay. For sanitation, we have similar definitions. We are talking about available services, physically and culturally accessible services, affordable again, safe, hygienic, and secure. We are obviously talking of a different issue than water quality. We are talking about the safe disposal of wastes in order to protect health. And in the right to sanitation, privacy and dignity are very key elements, and they are very particular for the right to sanitation and very linked to gender issues. We are talking basically about the protection of women and girls, and also LGBTI groups. Here again, some definitions of each of these elements of the normative content. I will not go in details on that. It's very important also to address the human rights principles. Those are principles applied to several economic, social, and cultural rights, not only the right to water and the right to sanitation. So equality and non-discrimination is a very key principle. Participation and inclusion also. I like very much this definition of every person is entitled to active, free, and meaningful participation. And this is very key in the water sector. The water sector has a tradition of a very technocratic approach. The engineers think that they know everything. They don't need to consult people. They know how to solve all the problems. And we know that it's not true. And so it's very important to include, and this is part of the framework of the human rights, include people in the decision-making process, particularly, and giving information, reliable and accurate information. Accountability is another very key principle of the human rights that needs to be applied to water and sanitation. And the very definition of progressive realization of the rights using the maximum available resources. So this is very important, this last definition, because it's important to highlight that in 2010, the resolution in the General Assembly was not adopted by consensus. We had 41 countries that voted, that abstained, actually. 123 that voted in favor and 41 that abstained. And there were an attempt in 2010 to adopt a similar, 2008, to adopt a similar resolution that was not approved because most of the countries were contrary to this adoption. And it's important to think why I'm talking about that now, because some of the countries that were not in favor of the resolution thought that if I support the resolution, I will be called violator tomorrow because a significant part of my population has no access to water or sanitation. But it's a wrong interpretation of the principle of the human rights. What is supposed to happen is a progressive realization and not a realization from the night to the day of the approval of the resolution. So this is a key element that means that all the efforts should be taken to ensure a progressive realization of those rights. So, and yeah, my feeling that we need to have a more in-depth discussion on that and how to translate this definition to the water and sanitation sector. Yeah, the special procedures of the human rights, we are part of those mechanisms related to the international human rights framework. There are several mechanisms. Some are bodies related to treaties. We have here several acronyms, but some are related. For instance, CEDAW is related to discrimination against women. The first one is the Committee of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. There is a body on people with disability, children, etc. And there are some mechanisms that are based on the Charter of the United Nations, the Human Rights Council, and under the Human Rights, not under, together with, maybe it's better to say that because you are not linked formally to the Council. We have the special procedures and also this review that is very key, the Universal Periodical Review. So the special procedures are appointed by the Council. There are 3 different types of special procedures, the special rapporteurs, the working groups, and independent experts. We are now 47 thematic mandates and 12 country mandates. And in those thematic mandates, we have several subjects related to human rights that are covered by the rapporteurs. I'm the rapporteur on water sanitation. I have a colleague that works with housing, other with health, education, extreme poverty, and there are several related basically to political and civil rights, like independence of judges, torture, etc., etc. And 12 deal with some particular countries that deserve a special attention in terms of human rights, like Belarus, Libya, Eritrea, and several others. We are independent, non-UN staff, and not paid. The no payment is a very important particularity of the mandate because it provides the necessary independence. It's a very time-consuming mandate. When I applied to the mandate, the official letter said that I need to plan my life to spend 3 months a year on the mandate. And I think I spent 3 months a year out of the mandate. So it's very time-consuming. And this is a problem because not everyone has the capacity to devote that time to a mandate. We have a lot of colleagues that are retired, but this cannot be a criteria to appoint people. You need to be retired. Well, what's our role? Myself, need to submit 2 thematic reports per year, one for the General Assembly and the other to the Human Rights Council. I undertake 2 country missions per year to 2 different countries. And there is a set of activities related to communications with countries, with governments, when we receive elements that show a possible violation of human rights. And this also involves press releases, the dissemination of those violations to the press, and engagement with authors. So we have a very broad set of activities, but I would say that basically these 2 first are the more standard activities that we need to perform. So I wanted to explain a little bit about the thematic reports, because I think this is one of the main contents of the mandate. And here we have some tips on elements of those human rights that requires more understanding, more research, more in-depth approach, I would say. So far, I developed 10 thematic reports. My term is finishing next year, so I will give 12. So in these 10 thematic reports, I try to use this very simple 3-dimensional framework, trying to identify subjects that are included in one of these 3 dimensions. The first dimensions are what I'm calling drivers that are macro determinants that can allow violations or realization of the rights. I will show some of the examples on that. And in this case, using the human rights as an analytical lens to identify situations or phenomena that can influence the realization of the rights. The second policy, mainly public policies, and how to think on elements of public policies that can support the realization of the human rights, water and sanitation. And the third dimension, people, here I'm addressing some particular groups that deserve more attention in terms of how to realize the rights to those groups. And under the first dimension, drivers, 3 of my reports addressed it. In 2015, I worked on affordability. Affordability, I still think, is something that deserves more exploration, more investment, more theoretical and empirical investment, because, as I said before, the water sector is not very aware, is not very focused on providing affordable services for those that need it. Accountability was a report of last year, 2017. And again, accountability is something not very familiar to the water sector, is very necessary to translate all the elements of accountability into the reality of water sector. And this can be a way to realize the rights in a more specific way. And Mega Project was a report that I just finished, and I just submitted it. It's again, elements that are external of the water sector that can impact the realization of the rights in several ways. And on policy, one first report was on level of services. Level of services meaning this was an important moment because 2015 was the year of the negotiation of the SDGs, and the level of services adopted in the MDGs was a level of services, the definition of the level of service, at least the level of service that was monitored by the UN agencies, was very far from the standard that the human rights to water and sanitation prescribed. And the idea was to discuss different levels of service and in which extent they can be used to realize the human rights. But here I also worked with the idea of management. So the level of service is not independent of the management of the services. Then a report in 2017 was on regulation, regulatory bodies, regulatory entities that are very, very common in the water sector, particularly when we have one provider. This is the standard of the water sector. The characteristic is that it's a natural monopoly, and usually we have only one provider and a regulator, and there is a big challenge in how to regulate a monopoly. And usually the regulators are very focused on the economic side of the provision, not on the human rights. So the idea was to explore different ways of regulating. And there were 2 reports on development cooperation, trying to address the way funders use the framework of the human rights to water and sanitation. And on people, I had a report on gender, then a report on forcibly displaced persons, refugees, migrants, IDPs, stateless, and one of my latest reports were on spheres of life beyond the household, focusing particularly or mostly on public spaces. I discuss institutions, but the main focus is on public space. So these are 3 groups, maybe, that are usually neglected, not very well. They are sometimes invisible for the providers, particularly these 2 ones, two latest. And the first one, the impacts on the lack of the deficient of services on women, girls, transgender is not very visible as well. So these are some examples. So if you want suggestions on themes to research, you have a very comprehensive menu here. Yeah. So what's the relationship between the human rights to water and sanitation and the SDG? I will highlight some issues. One is that it's interesting to know that in the document that introduces the SDGs, Transforming Our World, the only right that is explicitly mentioned is the right to water. So this puts responsibility in implementing the related targets. We have 2 targets more linked to the right to water and the right to sanitation. Target 6.1. The goal 6 is about water and sanitation for all. This goal has 6 targets and 2 more that are implementation, means of implementation targets. But the targets more related to those rights are 6.1, that is related to water, and 6.2 related to sanitation. And this is the language of the targets, and we can identify in these languages several of that elements that I presented in the normative content of the right. So we have I would say, an adequate alignment between the targets, the language of the targets, and the framework of the human rights. They are not the same. Human rights are different than the SDGs, but this alignment is very welcome. One problem is that when the UN translated the targets into indicators, we lost several of those contents. So we can see, for instance, in target 6.2, the target is to achieve access to adequate and equitable sanitation and hygiene for all, and end open defecation, paying special attention to the needs of women and girls and those in vulnerable situations. Everything was summarized in safely managed services. So this gap here is something that is a concern, because we can lose several elements of the human rights in the monitoring process. Safely managed services can be defined in different ways, and we can, in this process, have some losses. It's important also to highlight the interrelationship between goals, and obviously the goal 6 is related to several others: health, ending poverty, women, equality, reduction of inequalities in general, work, education, etc. So it's very important to have this cross-sectoral approach. And on the monitoring process, I would say that one of the main challenges is how to identify or how to disaggregate data in order to identify where the inequalities take place. So there are some possible disaggregation of data. One is that the monitoring is doing relatively well, is the disaggregation based on wealth quintiles. The two agencies that are monitoring the SDGs on water and sanitation are WHO and UNICEF through the JMP, Joint Monitoring Program. The other dimension is rural-urban. They are doing well because these data are available through census and other types of surveys. The second one is more challenge, how to monitor intra-urban inequalities, and we know that the cities are not homogeneous. Group-related inequalities, race, ethnicity, and migratory status also are important, and we have few data on that. And intra-household inequalities is very important, but it's not possible to do it globally. It requires, I would say, more qualitative methods to understand that inside a household, we don't have an homogeneous population also. We have the elderly, children, people with disability, with different requirements in terms of access to water and sanitation. So there are some data on those inequalities. This is a map on safely managed sanitation, and we can see this is just a confirmation that we have extreme gaps between countries. We are here, I think, yeah? And this is very different than here, or here, yeah, or here. So we have a large range of proportion of access to those services, from 0 to 25 to almost 100%. It's interesting because Norway is not in the top country, only Finland, I think. Something to think about.
Mountain cabins without sanitation.
Maybe the indigenous groups in the north, the extreme north. So inequalities across countries is very common. Here is a very interesting graph that the latest report shows. The first one showing difference in access between urban and rural and urban, and we can see that this is almost a standard across all the countries. In some countries the gaps are larger, in others we are talking here mainly about European countries, I think. The gaps are not that big. And here between wealth quintiles, showing that the richest, the most adequate is the access. And the gaps used to be very large here also. This is an exercise that we at Fiocruz did for the PAHO, Pan American Health Organization, comparing two very. The idea here is to recognize that the deprivation takes place together with several layers of deprivation. So here we compare two groups: one, urban population, white people in households with persons with graduate courses. And then with rural population, black people in families with people with elementary level of education. In some countries in Latin America, you can see that, for instance, in El Salvador, the gap is 92 percentage points between the two groups. So this shows that the inequalities in the access to, here is sanitation, can be very, very large. This is a graph in the latest report of JMP showing gender inequality. Not all countries will have this data, and they used an example from Sierra Leone, showing then when water is collected, is not available at the household level. In 60% of the situations are the women that collect water, and in 13 girls. Here, I think it's the same. I made a mistake. I wanted to show inequalities between indigenous groups and non-indigenous groups. In the next keynote, I'll bring. This is interesting also. It was produced by the JMP, again, showing that we need to be careful when we use averages. Averages mask inequalities. Here is an example of Guyana. It's an statistics about the population using improved drinking water sources. And here is the average of the world. Here, when we break down in different regions, we can, so here we have around 75%. In sub-Saharan Africa is 22%. So if we use the world average, we are masking several differences. When we take Latin America and the Caribbean, we can see the gaps. When we take Guyana, urban and rural is not that big, the difference. But when we use wealth quintiles in the urban area, we can see the gap. And when we disaggregate by department, states, I'm not sure, we can see also a huge difference. So it's very important also to break down the data and to show, not only because of an academic exercise, but when we show these inequalities, we are showing to the government what needs to be done, and this is a way to inform public policies. This is my view. We don't have good policies for what we don't know. So this is the main idea here. I will skip this and discuss a little bit this graph that was produced also by the JMP. This is a very interesting way to show the progress. Here we are comparing 2000 and 2017. And there are 4 areas here. In this area, we have countries that increased the coverage between these 17 years and increased equality. Okay, this is what they are supposed to do. But the more concerned is this part here, where the countries increased the coverage, but increased inequalities also. So the public policies were traditionally oriented to support those that are wealthiest, that have more resources to access the services. And here also there are, I think the main decreasing. Here's the worst situation. The coverage decreased and inequality increased also. So I think it's very important to see that. This is related to the progressive realization. Yeah. And the idea is that the countries focus on the population that has less resources, that are more vulnerable, that live in more vulnerable situation, and that are discriminated in the public policies. So this is the main challenge of the SDGs, and this is the main message, I'll say, of the human rights to the implementation of the SDGs. And synthesizing that, I would say that in all the countries, in the beginning of the period, we have always disadvantaged groups and advantaged groups, and if business as usual will be applied, we will have this. But the message of the human rights is to prioritize these disadvantaged groups and to try to close this gap as soon as possible. There are several discussions around that. People from the water sector would say, but if I do that, the systems will not be sustainable, economically sustainable, because I'm putting services in those that can't pay. But I don't agree with this argument. There are several ways to address that, but this is the main message of the human rights, and I would say this is the main message of also the 2030 agenda. The main slogan is leaving no one behind, and we need to leave no one behind as soon as possible. Okay, thank you very much.